The air in the amber note was thick with a specific kind of magic, the expensive kind. It wasn't the magic of fairy tales, but the magic of money, power, and quiet confidence. Soft light gleamed off polished wood and the edges of crystal glasses. The low hum of conversation was a steady engine, powered by deals being hinted at and connections being made. Laughter here was a soft, knowing chuckle, never a loud belly laugh. This was a place where people came to be seen, but only by the right eyes. Among them, she moved like a shadow in a well-practiced dance. Her name was Elena, but in this room, she was nobody's name. She was a presence in black, a simple dress, a neat apron, sensible shoes that made no sound on the dark floor. Her eyes were down, not in shyness, but in a focused rhythm. Table 7 needed a gin and tonic refresher. The couple in the corner were ready for their check. A water glass at the bar was empty. Her hands, when they weren't balancing a tray, were often curled slightly, as if holding something invisible. If you looked closely, which nobody did, you might see a faint, old callus on the tips of her fingers. They were not marks from carrying trays, but from a different kind of weight entirely, the weight of piano keys, pressed down for thousands of hours in a lonely apartment. Helena was 28, but in the dim light, she could pass for younger or older. The dreams she'd carried since childhood, shiny and bold, had been sanded down by the grit of real life. They weren't gone, but they were packed away, like a favorite book you know you won't have time to read. Student loans arrived like clockwork every month, a stubborn reminder of her degree in music composition, a degree that now seemed like a beautiful, useless artifact. Her apartment wasn't a home. It was a place to sleep between shifts, its silence a contrast to the constant murmur of the amber note. Her entire world in the bar orbited around one fixed point, the grand piano. It sat on a small raised stage in the corner, a sleek black beast under a single focused spotlight. It was treated with a reverence usually saved for religious objects. Only certain hands were allowed to touch it. Tonight, those hands belonged to Julian Crane, a jazz pianist with a sharp suit and a sharper reputation. His music was cool, complex, and highly sought after. Elena had served him once before. He'd asked for a specific brand of mineral water with a twist of lime, never looking at her face dot as the clock ticked closer to his performance time. The energy in the room shifted. The crowd, a mix of music producers, talent scouts, well-off fans, and local celebrities, began to glance more frequently toward the empty stage. This was what they paid the premium for, not just the cocktails, but the curated experience, the cultural badge of being here, now. For this, Elena's section included a prime table right near the stage. Two men sat there, deep in conversation. She'd overheard their introductions earlier. One was a vice president of A&R at a major label, a guy who said yes or no to recording contracts. The other was a well-known music publisher. Their talk was the background music to her work. Just so derivative, the A&R man was saying, swirling his scotch. Everything sounds like everything else. We're hunting for that authentic voice, you know. Something that hits you right here. He tapped his chest. Raw talent, the publisher agreed, nodding. Unpolished, real. It's the only thing that cuts through the noise anymore. Elena kept her face neutral as she cleared their empty small plate dishes. Raw talent. Unpolished, real. The words echoed in her head as she walked back to the kitchen. They were looking for a ghost, a myth. And all the while, the very thing they claimed to seek was refilling their water glasses and wiping the condensation from their table. She looked at the piano. To her, it wasn't just an instrument. It was a room. Inside it lived everything she couldn't say out loud, her frustration, her hope, the melody of the rainy city outside her window, the memory of her father's old records, the crushing silence of rejection. She knew the feel of its keys, even though she'd never touched this particular one. She knew the way sound could swell and live in the air. She had practiced Julian Crane's set list, not out of fandom, but as a study. She could play his complicated arrangements in her sleep, her fingers twitching the patterns on her thighs as she rode the bus home. But here, she was part of the furniture, a useful, silent piece of the scenery. The patron's eyes slid over her, seeing only the function, not the person. She was the hand that brought the drink, not the mind that could compose a symphony. It was a specific kind of loneliness, being invisible in a room full of people. She thought of the folder on her battered laptop at home, labeled Unheard. It was filled with her own compositions, pieces that were anything but background music. They were storms and sunrises, conversations and confessions. The one she called The Wait was a 5-minute journey built on the feeling of standing still while the world moved past. A melody that ached with longing but never quite gave in to sadness. A manager, David, a man permanently caught between pleasing his wealthy clients and controlling his staff, hurried past her. "Crane's late," he muttered to the bartender, not caring that Elena heard. 10 minutes. Keep the complimentary canapes flowing if he's not here by 9. Elena felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't anxiety for the bar. It was a strange electric feeling, like the air before a lightning strike. She looked at the powerful men at her table, still talking about real talent. She looked at the pristine, empty piano bench. She looked at her own hands, currently holding a damp cloth. For a moment, she allowed herself a fantasy. A silly, reckless daydream. What if she just walked over there? What if she sat down and played her music? Not Crane's, hers. What would their faces look like? The fantasy was so vivid, she could almost hear the first, shocking chord. But then reality, cold and familiar, washed back in. She would be fired on the spot. She'd be a laughingstock. The crazy waitress who thought she could play. They wouldn't hear the music. They'd only see the uniform where it didn't belong. The risk was total, and the reward was a fantasy. So, she pushed the thought down, deep into that place where she kept her old dreams. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and picked up a fresh tray. The clock kept moving. Julian Crane was now 15 minutes late. The respectful murmur of the crowd was tinted with the first hint of impatience. The stage remained empty, a silent, gaping mouth. The spotlight on the piano's lid seemed to grow brighter, waiting. And Elena continued her dance, a ghost among the living, the only one in the room who could possibly fill the silence that was about to descend. 9 o'clock came and went. The piano bench was still empty. The spotlight on the stage began to feel less like an invitation and more like an accusation. A low, restless energy started to replace the room's smooth hum. Elena felt it first at her tables. The couple near the wall kept checking their watches. The group of well-dressed friends laughed a little too loud, trying to fill the space where music should be. Her eyes kept drifting back to the A&R men. The publisher was scrolling on his phone now, his mouth a thin, unimpressed line. The A&R man, the one who talked about raw talent, was staring at the stage with a blank expression. He wasn't seeing potential anymore. He was seeing a problem. A hole in his evening. The manager, David, was a man coming apart at the seams. He stood by the service entrance, his phone pressed to his ear so hard it looked painful. Elena passed him with a tray of empty glasses. She caught his tense, hissed words. "You're telling me he's still at the airport? The flight was hours ago." A pause. His face flushed a deep red. "No, that is not acceptable." You guaranteed he would be here." He listened, then squeezed his eyes shut. "Forget the contract. You've left me looking like a fool in front of my entire clientele." He ended the call and stood there for a second, breathing heavily, as if trying to physically swallow his anger. Then he straightened his tie, forced a smile onto his face, and walked to the center of the room, clapping his hands together once, softly. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment." The conversations dipped. All eyes turned to him. Elena stopped wiping a table, her cloth frozen in her hand. "It appears," David said, the smile not reaching his eyes, "that our featured performer for the evening, the incredibly talented Julian Crane, has been unavoidably detained." He let out a small, practiced chuckle that sounded like a dry cough. "A travel snafu, completely beyond anyone's control. We do apologize for the inconvenience." A soft groan moved through the room. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy with disappointment. This wasn't a crowd that was used to disruptions. They paid for seamless elegance, not apologies. "In the meantime," David continued, raising his voice slightly, "please enjoy a complimentary round of champagne on the house. Our bar staff will bring it right around. We thank you for your understanding and your patience." He gave a little bow and quickly walked off the floor, heading straight for the bar. The forced smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure panic. "Open 3 bottles of the mid-tier," he snapped at the head bartender. "Not the good stuff. And fast." The complimentary champagne was poured and distributed. It was a nice gesture, but it was like putting a small bandage on a deep cut. For a few minutes, the clink of glasses and the fizzy pour provided a distraction. But the problem remained. The stage was a void. The grand piano, that beautiful, silent beast, seemed to mock the entire room. The A&R man took a sip of his champagne and set it down. "Unbelievable," he said to his companion. "You planned your whole night around this." "It's unprofessional. Tells you everything you need to know about the artist," the publisher replied, shrugging. "No respect for the audience." Elena heard this as she brought them fresh coasters. Their words stung in a strange way. They weren't meant for her, but they felt personal. No respect for the audience, but she was part of the audience too. She had also been looking forward to the music, even if it was just to study it, to hear how someone else filled the silence she loved. She saw David rushing past again, this time towards the back office, probably to call every semi-professional musician he knew in a state of desperation. The evening was unraveling minute by minute. The polite murmur was getting sharper, edged with annoyance. A few people at the bar were already settling their tabs, their night clearly ruined. That electric feeling was back in Elena's stomach, but now it was mixed with something else. It wasn't just a wild fantasy anymore. It was a clear, sharp picture. She saw the empty bench. She saw the restless, important crowd. She saw David's desperation. And she saw herself standing still, holding a tray, while a solution, a terrifying, impossible solution, was right there. The thought was so huge it made her feel dizzy. Her palms started to sweat. She walked to the service station, put down her tray, and gripped the cold steel counter. Asterisk, I could do it. I could actually do it. Asterisk, but the fear was a physical weight on her shoulders. The laughter, the humiliation, the certain firing. She imagined the snickers, the confused stares. She saw David's furious face. It would be a story they'd tell for weeks. Remember that waitress who lost her mind and tried to play? Yet, as she looked out at the disappointed faces, a different kind of anger began to push back against the fear. These people got to decide what was real talent. They got to sit in judgment, to be disappointed when their packaged entertainment didn't arrive. They lived in a world of yeses and nos, while their world was made of silence and maybe later. And right now, their perfect world had a hole in it. A hole only music could fill. Her music diet was insane. It was career suicide. But the piano just sat there, waiting. and the silence was getting louder. David burst out of the back office, his hair messy from running his hands through it. He looked at the stage like it was a monster about to eat his business. He was out of options. Elena watched him. This was her moment. If she waited another second, the courage would vanish completely. She stepped away from the counter. Her legs felt like they were made of wood. She didn't let herself think. She just moved, intercepting him as he hurried toward the bar. David. He tried to move around her, his eyes wild. Not now, Elena. For God's sake, can't you see this is a disaster? She planted her feet, blocking his path just enough to make him stop. Her heart was hammering so hard, she was sure he could hear it. David, I can play. He stared at her. For a full 3 seconds, he just blinked, as if her words were in a foreign language. His brain, fried from panic, couldn't process it. What? The piano, she said, her voice quieter than she wanted. She forced it to be steady. I can play. I can fill in. Just for 20 minutes. Until you figure something else out. He shook his head, a quick, irritated jerk. Don't be ridiculous. Go check on table 5. He went to push past her dot. This was it. This was the cliff edge. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a fierce, urgent whisper. I know his set list. Julian Crane's. I've practiced it. I know it note for note. I can play it right now. Or I can play something else. But I can play. This time, the words got through. He stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time all night. He saw the waitress, the uniform, the tired eyes. But he also saw something else, a desperate certainty in her face that matched his own desperation. His mind was a battlefield. On one side, the utter insanity of letting a waitress perform for this crowd. The potential for a catastrophic, laughing-stock embarrassment that would be worse than an empty stage. On the other side, the empty stage right now. The departing customers. The death of the evening's atmosphere. He looked past her at the crowd. He saw the A&R man looking at his watch. He saw the publisher putting on his coat. That decided it. He turned back to Elena, his face grim. Fine. The word was like a gunshot. Fine. You get up there. You play classical. Background music. Chopin, Mozart. Nice and quiet. Nothing fancy. Nothing original. Do you understand? You are a placeholder. A human CD, 20 minutes. That's it. Elena just nodded. A quick, sharp movement. Her mouth was too dry to speak. And for God's sake, he hissed, take off that apron. He turned and hurried toward the bar, probably to get another drink for his nerves. Elena stood frozen for one more second. Then her hands flew to the knot of her apron at her back. Her fingers, usually so sure on keys, fumbled with the simple tie. It came loose. She pulled the black apron over her head, crumpled it into a ball, and shoved it onto the service counter. She was now just a woman in a simple black dress. She felt terrifyingly exposed. Every eye in the room would be on her. There was no uniform to hide behind now. She turned and faced the stage. The walk across the floor felt like a mile. The quiet conversations seemed to hush as she moved through the tables, not around them. She felt the confusion, the curious glances. Asterisk, isn't that the waitress? Where is she going? Asterisk, she didn't look at anyone. She kept her eyes on the piano bench. As she stepped up onto the small stage, the spotlight, which had felt so accusing before, now felt blinding. It was hot. It swallowed her. She sat down on the cool leather of the bench. The grand piano loomed in front of her, massive and powerful. She gently lifted the fallboard, revealing the neat row of black and white keys. They gleamed under the light, waiting. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, taking one deep, shaking breath. She could feel the weight of the room's expectation, their confusion, their low-grade annoyance. She remembered David's command: classical, background, quiet. Her fingers found the keys. They felt familiar and alien all at once. This was a finer instrument than she had ever touched. She pressed down. The first clear, clean notes of a Chopin nocturne floated out into the quieting room. They were soft, respectful, technically perfect. She played it exactly as requested: beautiful, inoffensive wallpaper music. A few people glanced over, mildly surprised. Then slowly, they turned back to their conversations, their champagne. The crisis seemed to be temporarily contained. The waitress was playing nice music. How quaint. The manager had pulled the odd, but harmless, rabbit out of his hat at her table. The A&R man gave a slight, dismissive nod and finally took a real drink of his champagne. The publisher put his coat back on his chair. Elena played the Chopin, her body following the instructions, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She was thinking of the folder called Unheard. She was thinking of the words raw and real. She was thinking of a lifetime of being quiet, of being background. The final lingering note of the nocturne faded into the air. There was a brief, polite pause. Elena closed her eyes. She didn't think about David or the crowd or getting fired. She thought about the rain on her window. She thought about the weight of the silence in her apartment. She thought about the feeling of being unseen. Her hands shifted on the keys. And she began to play something else. The final, polite chord of the Chopin piece hung in the air for a second, then dissolved. A few people gave a soft, absent-minded clap, the kind you offer to street musicians as you walk by. It was background noise again. They turned back to their conversations, ready to ignore the stage once more. Elena kept her eyes closed. The world was just the feel of the smooth, cool keys under her fingers and the faint scent of old wood and lemon polish from the piano. All the noise, the clinking glasses, the low chatter, her own pounding heart, it all faded away. It was just her and the silence she knew so well, the silence she had filled 1,000 times in her empty apartment, in that quiet space inside her head. A different melody woke up. It wasn't written on any sheet music. It was the sound of the city at 3 a.m., when the streets were slick with rain and the only light came from a lonely street lamp. It was the feeling of holding a demo CD, still warm from the case, and dropping it into a mailbox, knowing it was like throwing a pebble into the ocean. It was the slow, heavy ache of waiting for a sign that never came. Her left hand drifted lower on the keyboard. It started with a low, deep, repeating pattern. It wasn't flashy. It was patient. It was the sound of footsteps on a long walk home. It felt like a heartbeat, steady and a little sad at her table. The A&R man was mid-sentence, talking about a new studio they were building. And the acoustics are going to be entirely... His voice trailed off. His friend, the publisher, had stopped listening. He was staring at the stage, his head tilted slightly, like a bird hearing a strange new call. The low pattern from Elena's left hand was joined by her right. It entered softly, a single searching line of notes. It wasn't a happy tune. It was a question. It climbed a little, hesitated, fell back, then tried a different path. It was the musical sound of someone looking for something they've lost. It was delicate, but there was a strength in it, a refusal to give up the search. All over the amber note, conversations began to falter. It wasn't a dramatic stop. It was a slow draining away of sound. Someone would be laughing, then the laugh would die in their throat as their ears caught the music. A woman telling a story would pause, listen for a second, and then forget to finish her sentence. The music wasn't loud, but it was commanding. It didn't ask for attention. It pulled attention toward it, gently but irresistibly. The manager, David, was at the bar, nursing a glass of water and watching the crowd with nervous eyes. He heard the shift. He heard the chop and end and expected more of the same. But this new sound was different. It was personal. A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. She's not playing classical, he thought. He wanted to run over and stop her, but he was frozen. The room was too quiet. Any movement would be a disturbance. Elena was far away now. The music was building from a feeling into a story. The left hand's footsteps grew a little quicker, a little more urgent. The right hand's searching melody found a short, beautiful phrase, a moment of hope, and repeated it, climbing higher. It was like remembering a happy memory, so clearly it almost hurt. For a few bars, the music swelled with something like warmth, like sunlight breaking through clouds on a gray day. The A&R man was completely still. He wasn't thinking about acoustics anymore. He was leaning forward, his elbows on the table, his chin resting on his folded hands. He was watching the woman on stage. He saw the way her shoulders moved, not with the stiff formality of a trained performer, but with a natural flow, as if the music was a physical thing moving through her. He saw the faint line of concentration between her eyebrows. This was not a placeholder. This was not background noise. This was a confession happening in real time. The hopeful phrase in the music began to change. It got tangled up with darker, more complicated chords. The left hand's pattern became more insistent, almost like a knocking. The right hand struggled against it. The music was fighting now. It was the sound of hope bumping up against disappointment, of talent meeting closed doors. It was powerful and raw, and it filled every corner of the plush, quiet room. A woman near the front had tears in her eyes. She wasn't sure why. The music wasn't telling a specific story she knew, but it was pulling a feeling straight out of her own chest. A man who had been checking his phone let it fall onto the table, screen down. He just listened. Elena's fingers flew, now strong, now soft. She was playing the piece she called Await. She was pouring every silent year, every dismissed dream, every moment of believing in something nobody else could see, right into the piano. The instrument was no longer just wood and wire. It was her voice. And it was a voice that shook. She reached the climax of the piece. It wasn't a loud, crashing bang. It was a moment of immense pressure, and then a release. The searching melody from the right hand finally broke free, soaring up into the high notes, clear and bright and heartbreakingly beautiful, while the left hand's pattern finally resolved, finding a quiet, solid chord to stand on. It was a moment of triumph, but a lonely one. It was the sound of winning a battle, only you knew you were fighting. Then, as quickly as it soared, it began to settle. The music came back down, softening, slowing. The melody repeated its original, questioning phrase, but it was different now. It was wiser. It was sadder, but it was also at peace. The final notes were simple. A few clean, resonant chords that seemed to shimmer in the air long after. Her fingers had left the keys. She lifted her hands and placed them back in her lap. She opened her eyes. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a different silence than before. Before, it had been an empty, disappointed silence. This was a full, stunned, and deeply felt silence. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just been spoken to, truly spoken to, for the first time all night. For 3 long seconds, no one moved. No one clapped. They were all just breathing in the space where the music had been. Then, from the back of the room, someone started to clap. It was one person, clapping slowly, firmly. Asterisk clap, clap. Clap, asterisk, it was the A&R man. He was on his feet. His face was serious. Intense. It was like a spell broke. Suddenly, the entire room erupted. The applause wasn't polite. It was thunderous. It was a wave of sound that hit the stage. People were cheering, whistling, standing up from their chairs. The woman who had tears was now wiping them away, smiling and clapping wildly. The man who'd put his phone down was shouting, "Bravo!" David stood behind the bar, his mouth open. The look of panic was gone, replaced by pure, uncomprehending shock. He looked at the cheering crowd, then at the small woman sitting quietly at the piano, looking almost as surprised as he was. Elena blinked, coming back to the room. The sound of the applause was physical, like a warm wind. She hadn't expected this. She had expected to be stopped, or laughed at, or ignored. She had not expected this roaring, grateful noise. It was overwhelming. She felt a hot prickling behind her own eyes. She gave a small, awkward nod to the crowd, unsure of what else to do. The A&R man was no longer just clapping. He was moving. He weaved through the tables, followed closely by the publisher. They weren't heading for the exit. They were heading straight for the stage. The other patrons watched them, the energy in the room shifting from appreciation to curiosity. Something was happening. Elena saw them coming. For a second, the old fear returned. Were they coming to tell her off? To complain? The A&R man reached the edge of the stage. He looked up at her. His earlier expression of bored power was completely gone. Now he looked alive, focused, almost excited. "That," he said, his voice cutting through the dying applause. "What was that?" "The piece you just played." "What is it called?" Elena's voice, unused all night, came out as a whisper. She had to clear her throat. It's called The Wait." He nodded slowly, as if the title made perfect sense. "Is it yours? Your own composition?" "Yes," she said, her voice a little stronger. He turned to his friend, the publisher, and they exchanged a look that held a whole silent conversation. Then he turned back to her, and he did something she had never seen him do all night. He smiled. It was a real smile. "My name is Robert," he said, extending a hand up towards her. "I think we need to talk." The roar of the applause was a warm, heavy blanket around Elena's shoulders. It was so loud it felt quiet inside her head. She saw the man Robert reaching his hand up toward the stage, his face serious but open. Behind him, the other man, the publisher, was nodding, a small, tight smile on his face. She hesitated for only a second. Then she stood up from the piano bench, her legs feeling shaky, like she'd just stepped off a boat onto solid land. She stepped down from the small stage and took his hand. His grip was firm, confident. "That was not what I expected," Robert said, his voice low enough that only she and his friend could hear over the lingering noise of the crowd. People were still clapping, but now they were also talking excitedly, gesturing toward her. The energy in the room buzzing like a live wire. "I'm sorry," she started to say, the old habit of apology kicking in. "The manager, he said just to play classical. Robert shook his head, cutting her off. "Don't apologize, ever, for that." He glanced around, seeing the other patrons watching them with keen interest. "Is there somewhere we can talk? Somewhere a little less public?" Just then, the manager, David, appeared at her elbow. His face was a strange mix of emotions, shock, relief, and a dawning, frantic calculation. He had seen the two most important men in the room rush to her side. The disaster had turned into something else entirely. "My office," David said quickly, his voice full of a new, eager respect. "Please, right this way. Can I get you anything? Water? Something stronger?" Robert just gave a brief nod, his eyes still on Elena. "Lead the way." David practically scurried ahead, clearing a path through the crowd. Elena walked between the two powerful men, feeling like she was in a dream. People smiled at her as she passed. A few reached out to gently touch her arm. "Beautiful," a woman whispered. "Stunning," said another. The walk to the back office felt longer than the walk to the stage had. This time, instead of curious stares, she felt looks of deep interest, of re-evaluation. The ghost had become a person. David's office was a small, cluttered room with a desk piled with invoices and a couple of stiff chairs. He hurried to clear them off. Please sit." Robert and the publisher, who introduced himself simply as Mark, took the chairs. David hovered by the door, unsure if he should stay or go. Robert gestured for Elena to take the seat behind the desk, the manager's own chair. She sank into it, feeling awkward. "So," Robert began, leaning forward. "Elena, is it?" She nodded. "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was 6, she said, her voice still a bit thin. "And you work here?" "As a waitress?" "Yes. Why?" The question wasn't rude. It was direct, puzzled. "With hands like that? With that kind of compositional sense?" Elena looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. The calluses were faint, but there. She shrugged, a small, helpless movement. It was the biggest question of her life, and the answer was 1,000 small things. I tried. I sent out demos. I played in small cafes for tips. It never led anywhere. I have bills to pay. Mark, the publisher, spoke for the first time. His voice was quieter, more thoughtful. "What you just played out there? The wait, do you have more? Original pieces?" "Yes," Elena said, a flicker of pride cutting through the numbness. "A lot more. A whole folder of them." "On paper? Recorded?" Robert asked. "Both. I have sheet music, and I have rough recordings on my laptop at home. Just me and a keyboard, but you can hear the ideas." The two men exchanged another one of those looks. Robert took a business card from his inside jacket pocket. It was thick, expensive cardstock. He placed it on the desk in front of her. "I want you to come to my office tomorrow, 10 a.m. Bring everything. The sheet music, the recordings, all of it." Elena stared at the card. The embossed letters swam a little in her vision. It was the name of the record label, the one she had sent a demo to 3 years ago. She had gotten a form letter rejection email in return. What for? She asked, the words barely a whisper. "To listen," Robert said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Properly. In a studio, not over the noise of a cocktail bar. What you did out there, that wasn't just good playing. That was a voice. People spend their whole careers looking for a voice that's authentic, that has something to say. And you found yours while serving gin and tonics." He almost laughed, but it was a laugh of amazement, not mockery. Mark leaned in. "The piece is publishable. It's complex, emotional. It has a narrative arc. It's not just a song. It's a story. There's a market for that. The right market." David, from the doorway, couldn't contain himself. "I always knew she had something special. The way she carried herself. You could just tell." No one paid him any attention. Elena's mind was racing. This was happening too fast. An hour ago, her biggest worry was whether Table 3 would stiff her on the tip. Now these men were talking about studios and publishing. A cold thread of doubt wound through the shock. Is this just because of the moment? The surprise of it all? Because I was the waitress who played? Robert's face grew serious. He looked her right in the eyes. "No, it's because of the music. The surprise got my attention. I won't lie. But the music held it. It captured it. If you had walked in off the street and played that, I'd be saying the same thing. The context just makes a hell of a story." He allowed himself a small smile. And this business loves a good story. Outside the office door, they could hear the buzz of the bar. The pianist who was supposed to follow Julian Crane, a local blues player, had started his set. But the energy of the room had permanently shifted. The night was now about what had happened before. "Tomorrow at 10, Robert repeated, standing up. Mark stood as well. "Don't be late. And don't overthink it. Just bring your music." They shook her hand again, their grips firm and full of promise. David escorted them out, falling over himself with polite goodbyes. Then he rushed back into the office and shut the door. He looked at Elena, who was still sitting in his chair, holding the business card like it was a sacred object. "Elena, I don't know what to say." He ran a hand through his hair. "You saved the night. You saved it. Forget about your shift. You're done. Paid for the full night, of course. In fact," he fumbled in a drawer, pulled out an envelope of petty cash, and counted out several large bills, laying them on the desk next to the business card. "A bonus, for exceptional service." She looked at the money, then back at him. The fear of being fired was gone, replaced by this. It was confusing. Can I just have a minute?" She asked. Of course. Take all the time you need." David practically bowed himself out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. Silence. The thick, soundproofed silence of the small office was a shock after the noise of the bar and the intense conversation. Elena just sat there, breathing. She looked at the business card. She touched the edge of it with her finger. It was real. She thought about her apartment. The silent keyboard in the corner. The folder on her laptop labeled "Unheard." She thought about the long bus ride home she would have taken. Still invisible, another night gone. A slow, deep warmth began to spread through her chest, pushing out the cold shock. It wasn't excitement yet. It was the simple, overwhelming feeling of being seen. Not as a waitress, not as a background fixture, but as what she actually was. A musician. She picked up the business card and the cash. She put them both in her pocket. She stood up, her legs finally steady. When she walked out of the office and through the back hallway of the bar, it felt different. The kitchen staff, who usually nodded vaguely in her direction, looked up and smiled. The bartender gave her a thumbs up. She didn't go back out onto the main floor. She didn't need to. She collected her coat from the staff closet and pushed open the heavy back door, stepping out into the cool night air of the alley. The city sounds greeted her distant traffic, a siren, the hum of life. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel separate from it. She felt a part of it. She put her hands in her pockets, one hand closing around the thick paper of the business card. She started the walk home, but her steps weren't the tired, slow trudge they usually were. They were light. The night wasn't over. It was just beginning. And for the first time in years, the wait was finally over. The cool night air of the alley was a shock, but a good one. It cleared the last of the dizzy fog from Elena's head. The heavy door of the amber note swung shut behind her, sealing away the world of soft light and roaring applause. Out here, it was just dumpsters, concrete, and the distant glow of the city. She walked, her footsteps echoing slightly in the narrow space. The usual tired ache in her feet was gone, replaced by a strange floating energy. Her mind was a whirlwind, trying to catch up with the last hour. One moment, she was wiping a table, invisible. The next, she was being handed a lifeline on thick, expensive cardstock. She reached the mouth of the alley and turned onto the main street. The city looked different. The neon signs from the bars and late-night cafes seemed brighter, more intentional. The people passing by weren't just a blur. She saw their faces, wondered about their own quiet battles, their own unexpected turns. She felt connected to it all in a way she hadn't for years. Her hand was in her coat pocket, her fingers tracing the sharp edges of the business card over and over. It was real. It was in her pocket. 10 a.m., the words pulsed in her mind like a heartbeat. When she got back to her apartment building and climbed the stairs, the familiar hallway didn't feel so oppressive. She unlocked her door and stepped inside. The silence was the same, but it was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. It was her silence, the one she filled with music. She didn't turn on the bright overhead light. She just flicked on the small lamp by the window, which cast a warm pool of light over her second-hand keyboard and the messy pile of sheet music on the desk. She took off her coat and hung it up, carefully placing the business card on top of the keyboard, right in the center. For a long time, she just sat on the edge of her bed, looking at it. The adrenaline was finally draining away, leaving a deep, quiet exhaustion. But underneath the tiredness, something else was stirring. A nervous, fluttering hope. The kind she had worked very hard to put to sleep. She thought about Robert's words. Asterisk. People spend their whole careers looking for a voice that authentic. Asterisk. He heard it. He actually heard it. Not just the notes, but the years in them, the patience, the frustration. He heard the story. And then she thought about tomorrow. 10 a.m., a professional recording studio. Men like that, they heard potential all the time. Maybe this was just a polite gesture, a nice thing to do for the waitress who saved their evening. Maybe she would go, play her pieces on a fancy piano, and they would nod, say lovely, and show her the door. The thought was a cold splash of water. The fear was still there. It had just changed its clothes. Before, it was the fear of humiliation. Now, it was the fear of hope, the fear that this chance, this real, tangible chance, might slip through her fingers, and the fall back down would be worse than before. She stood up and went to her laptop. She opened the folder labeled Unheard. There were dozens of files. Audio recordings with names like Rain Pattern, Metro Midnight, Questions for the Quiet. She opened the sheet music for The Wait. The ink slightly faded from years of being handled. These weren't just exercises. They were pieces of her. To offer them up for judgment felt more vulnerable than playing on the stage ever had. She gathered everything. She printed fresh copies of her best 5 compositions. She transferred the audio files to a USB drive. She made a neat small pile on her desk. It looked so small. Was it enough? Sleep was impossible. She lay in the dark, her mind racing through every possible scenario for the morning. Eventually, the deep tiredness won, pulling her into a fitful, dream-filled sleep where pianos grew to the size of buildings, and she was always running to catch a bus that left without her. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The morning was bright and clear. She dressed carefully, not in her waitress black, but in the one nice outfit she owned, simple, dark pants and a soft green sweater. She looked like herself, not an employee. She put the papers and the USB drive into a bag, took one last look at the business card, and headed out the door. The record label's office was in a sleek, glass building downtown. The lobby was all marble and quiet efficiency. Her worn sneakers squeaked on the polished floor. She gave Robert's name at the front desk, her voice barely a whisper. The receptionist smiled, made a call, and directed her to the elevators. 12th floor. They're expecting you. The ride up was silent and too fast. The doors opened directly into a reception area that was somehow both modern and cozy, with framed gold and platinum records on the walls. A different assistant greeted her. Robert is just finishing up a call. Can I get you some water or coffee? Water, please, Helena managed to say. She sat on the edge of a plush sofa, her bag on her lap like a shield. A moment later, Robert came out. He looked different. In the daytime, less like a powerful night creature, and more like a busy, focused man. But his smile was the same direct and genuine. "Elena, you came. Good. Come on back." He led her not to a stark office, but to a small, comfortable listening room. There was a sofa, some chairs, and a massive set of speakers. Mark, the publisher, was already there, sitting with a notebook. In the center of the room was a beautiful baby grand piano. "You brought your things?" Robert asked. She nodded, handing him the folder and the USB drive. He took them without looking, placing them on a table. "Later. First, I want to hear the weight again. On a proper instrument, in a proper room. No distractions." He gestured to the piano. Her mouth went dry. This was it. The real test. The bar had been a moment of wild courage. This was a calculated risk. She walked to the piano, sat down, and, for a second, felt like she was back on the stage at the Amber Note, terrified. She placed her hands on the keys. This piano was even more responsive, the sound even richer. She closed her eyes. She didn't think about the men in the room. She thought about the feeling, the long wait. She began to play. The music filled the acoustically perfect room. It was clearer, more detailed, every emotion amplified. She played it even better than she had the night before, because now she wasn't fighting through shock. She was simply telling the story. When she finished, the room was quiet. Robert was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Mark was scribbling notes. He looked up. "Play the one you call Rain Pattern." She was startled. He'd looked at her files. She hadn't even noticed. She found the sheet music in her mind and began to play. It was a more rhythmic, percussive piece, imitating the sound of a steady downpour against a window pane. Then she played a third, a shorter, more hopeful piece called Morning Maybe. When she stopped after the third piece, Robert finally spoke. He didn't gush. He didn't cheer. He talked like a craftsman assessing good material. "Your technique is solid. More than solid. But it's your musicality that's special. You don't just play notes. You shape sound. You understand tension and release." He picked up her sheet music for the weight. "This structure, it's not standard. It follows a feeling, not a formula. That's hard to do well. You did it." Mark nodded. "We'd like to publish the weight and rain pattern to start. There's a niche, but a passionate one, for contemporary solo piano like this. We can get this into the right hands film streaming playlists." Robert stood up. "And I want to record an EP, a short album. Just you and a piano. No orchestras, no fancy production. Clean, pure, exactly what we heard today. We'll book studio time for next month." Elena felt the room tilt. "An album?" "A recording project," he said, as if it was the most logical next step. "To capture this moment, this sound, we'll start small. See how it connects." He looked at her, his gaze steady. "This isn't a charity case, Elena. This is business. I believe there are people who will want to listen to this. I believe they will find it, and they will feel something. That's the product." It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her about her music. It wasn't about making her a star. It was about sharing a voice. That she could understand. They talked for another hour about details, contracts, next steps. It was a blur of legal words and dates. An assistant brought in a simple letter of intent for the publishing and a preliminary agreement for the recording. It wasn't a life-changing sum of money, but it was a first step, a real, professional, forward-moving step. When she finally left the building, the morning sun was high in the sky. She stood on the sidewalk, the signed papers in her bag, the weight of them wonderful and terrifying. She didn't go straight home. She walked to the small city park and sat on a bench. The ordinary world went on, people walking dogs, pigeons fighting over crumbs, a child chasing a balloon. She thought about the long, quiet years of practice, the doubt, the feeling that she was shouting into a void. She hadn't been. She had been building something, note by note, piece by piece, and last night, a door had cracked open. Not because of a lucky break, but because when the moment came, she was ready. She had the music. She was the music. She wasn't naive. She knew this was just a beginning. There was hard work ahead, studio sessions, maybe small performances, the scary act of putting her private heartbeats out into the world for sale. It might lead to more. It might not. But that was okay. For now, the silence had been broken. The waitress had stepped to the piano, and for the first time, the world had leaned in to listen. And now, she had something to do besides wait. She stood up from the bench, a small, sure smile touching her lips. She had a studio to book and pieces to practice. The walk home felt like the first walk of a very long and finally interesting journey.